Uh, I think one thing people should keep their eye on is the doomsday clock kept by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which has been pushed to 90 seconds to midnight, which I regard as an accurate representation of how close we are to nuclear Armageddon. The clock is the closest that it has ever been since the start of the doomsday clock in 1947. We are absolutely pushing towards nuclear war in Ukraine. Russia, of course, has 1,700 deployed nuclear weapons, or 1,600 deployed nuclear weapons, and thousands more tactical nuclear weapons. That's the strategic count. The US, the same. We are told daily by these geniuses in the Pentagon and in the military-industrial complex, don't worry about it. Don't be blackmailed about nuclear risks. It's unbelievable to be told that, because anybody that knows the history of the nuclear age knows how close we have come to nuclear war on several occasions, and how many generals in the United States have urged nuclear attack. One of the reasons for the absolutely ardent, to the point of war, opposition of Russia to NATO enlargement is the prospect of missiles minutes away from Russian territory. Part of this risk goes back to 2002, when the United States unilaterally abandoned the ABM treaty. This was a devastating blow to the nuclear framework and to peace. And it was one of the key steps on the way to war in Ukraine, because not only did the US abandon the ABM treaty, but it positioned Aegis missiles in Poland and Romania. And Russia made the very good point: we don't know what you're putting down those missile silos, but they can reach us in minutes. And this has been one of the top points emphasized by Russia all along. Then the United States, of course, under Trump, abandoned the INF treaty and has embarked on a multi-trillion-dollar upgrade, so-called, of our nuclear arsenal. So the US plays with this, and it tells us, don't be worried. It's terrifying, and of course be worried. Once in 2022, in the fall, Biden blurted out, or he didn't blurt out, he was caught on camera in a fundraiser in California that we're on a path to nuclear Armageddon. And you know what the response of the media was the next day? To chastise the president for saying this. He was attacked. How dare a president worry the American people this way? Well, that was the last we heard of it. His political advisors in the White House no doubt lectured our president, don't ever worry the American people this way again. So if you're not worried, you should be terrified. If I could add a word also, there were two unipolar moments in the world after World War II. The first was immediately after World War II, when the United States stood almost alone, untouched, or nearly untouched by physical war, and with a booming and technologically leading, even dominant, industrial sector, and as the sole holder of atomic weapons, very briefly. And the US created many institutions at the time that were partly multilateral and partly US led and based, like the Bretton Woods institutions. The second unipolar moment was at the end of 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. China was still a very, very poor country. The Soviet Union lay in ruins, and the United States neoconservatives, Cheney, Wolfowitz, Rumsfeld, in the final year of the Bush senior administration created the concept of how the U.S. would preserve its unipolarity. But these were moments, as Professor Moon just said, because today the economic reality is we're already in a multipolar world. The BRICS countries are a larger share of the world economy than the G7 if measured at international prices, that is purchasing power, parity adjusted GDP. This is momentous. We will not have a bipolar world because there are other poles of the world. India is behind China in its catching up process by 15 years perhaps, or 20 years, but it's now advancing strongly. It's even more populous than China and will become much more populous than China as China's population peaks, ages, and India's continues to grow for several decades more. Africa will be a pole of the world society in the coming decades because the African countries are figuring out that the imperial powers left them as 55 divided small nations, but they are unifying in the African Union. The list goes on. I think the kind of world practically that will evolve should evolve, is a UN charter-based world with suitable reforms, strong regional groupings like RCEP that end Cold War outdated divisions, and a lot of international relations among major regions, Europe, Russia and Central Asia, RCEP, South Asia, African Union, a UNISUR group of South America, and so forth. So multilateralism and regionalism on an economic basis, because creating a zero carbon energy system, bringing Australia's sunshine by submarine cable to ASEAN, integrating in the Asia Pacific region on a new green infrastructure and industry is a regional scale effort. So this world already exists, except at the Council of Foreign Relations and in the minds of the US security establishment. We're already past the unipolar moment. It's just that the United States doesn't know it and doesn't accept it.
I can tell you, I headed an institute at Columbia University, the Earth Institute, for 14 years with hundreds of climate scientists. It was a terrifying job because every week a colleague would come up to me and say, Jeff, it's worse than we thought. And the great climate scientist, my colleague James Hansen, has been telling me and telling the world for years, not only are we warming at an alarming and unsustainable rate, but the warming itself is accelerating. And he has been saying for years that even during the La Nina phase of the Pacific, which cools the planet, we continued to warm. In other words, the underlying warming was so great that even the La Ninas didn't stop the warming process, but he kept saying to me and saying to the world, wait till we go to an El Nino. Boom. Now we're in an El Nino and the temperatures are jumping. We're setting records. We could hit and exceed that 1.5 degrees Celsius level within the next 3, 4, 5 years. That was supposed to be the absolute ceiling. Now, the what to do has been known for a long time, which is to move from the coal, oil, and gas economy to one based on wind, solar, geothermal, hydropower, nuclear, and others that don't burn carbon. And this has been understood, to move to electric vehicles, to move to heating our buildings with electricity rather than heating oil, and so on. But we have to do it, and we have to do it at a global scale. And Congress has dragged its feet because of the big oil lobby, really corruption basically, for years and years and years, paying these campaigns of our congressmen and so forth. And the United States has been one of the foot draggers in this process, shockingly.
Right, and some would argue, though, that it isn't just the United States and that you have to include, you are someone who said we must include places like China or India. But I want to get down to something that you've really drilled down on in the last few years, and that's the fact that countries need to commit to what you call decarbonizing the energy system. How does that work in economic reality today? We know what the problem is. We've heard it, and we can feel it, so many of us, when we go outside. What can we do today?
Yeah, here's the interesting thing. Today, we can only take these steps that are needed. Now, what are they? They're very straightforward. To shift from producing our electricity with coal or oil or natural gas to producing it with wind, solar, hydro, and so forth. To electrify our vehicles, to electrify the heating and cooking in buildings, to electrify the parts of industry that can be electrified, and to use hydrogen produced with clean electricity for the parts that can't be electrified directly. Now, this is all known. We need a plan, a game plan, and we need to finance this. Now, here's the interesting thing about the costs. The costs are higher up front, but lower down the road, because if you go to solar, you don't pay for fuel down the road. So a higher capital cost, but a lower operating cost, a lower zero fuel cost. The fuel comes automatically from the sunshine. And so it turns out, if you have reasonable financing, it's not even more expensive over the time of a long-term project. The problem has been the lobbying, the misunderstandings, the misinformation, and the fact that our government's so much more interested in fighting wars or in having conflicts with China rather than sitting down and properly discussing how are we going to save the planet together. Right. And that's what we really need to do.
Now, and understood, you have also pointed out that the Inflation Reduction Act doesn't go far enough in terms of meeting those goals. But also, studies have singled out here the impact on productivity, agricultural output, of course, human health, that we've had, thousands of deaths due to climate change each and every year. Where do you see this going, especially when it comes to the industrialized economies versus the developing economies? Because you know that the developing economies are looking at us going, why is this our problem? We should be compensated for what you have already done to the planet.
Well, first of all, I mean, the alarm bells are ringing. I zoomed into a sixth grade class in Brooklyn last week to talk to them about these issues. The kids are wearing masks because of the forest fires in Canada. It's just tragic. Can't we protect our children? This is the first point. Second, we need to get the financing to enable the poorer countries to be able to do what needs to be done. They're ready to do it, actually. What they're saying is, fine, make sure we can finance this on the same terms that the rich countries can. We're ready to do it because we're suffering otherwise. It's 120 degrees in North Africa. They're not resisting movement on this. It's same in India, disaster. But they're saying create a system of finance. That depends on the U.S. Congress. Vote some money for the World Bank so the World Bank can make a long-term loan to a developing country so that it can have the capital that it needs to make the investment in wind or solar. It's really not so complicated, but we have to get beyond the oil lobby in the United States, the corruption of the Congress in the United States. We have to get to real practical solutions.